The mountains breathed a thin veil of mist that morning, a pale blue shroud clinging to their jagged shoulders. The train hissed and groaned as if exhausted from the climb, its iron belly heaving steam across a platform that seemed deserted, but for a handful of watchful eyes. Clara Whitfield stepped down from the carriage, her boots striking the frost-slicked boards with hesitant rhythm. She pulled her wool cloak tighter around her frame, its city tailoring out of place against the coarse silhouettes of the men leaning on railings, their faces weathered by wind and work. They didn't speak, but their gaze pressed against her back like a weight. She felt the scrutiny in the slow curl of pipe smoke, in the tilt of a hat brim that hid a pair of narrowed eyes. She carried a single carpet bag, and a letter folded so often the creases had worn through. Its contents had been read enough to be memorized. A promise of companionship, a home in the high country, the end of years spent in stifling drawing rooms where her laughter never sounded right and her hands felt useless. She had imagined snow-dusted pines and a porch where her solitude would be respected, where she might shed the shame of her past life like an old coat. Instead, the platform smelled of coal smoke and suspicion. Even the wind seemed to whisper against her cheek, "Stranger, stranger, stranger." The main street was a thin ribbon of mud, lined with squat buildings whose windows glowed dimly against the late afternoon gloom. Her breath clouded the air as she walked, boots sinking slightly in slush that had frozen into a patchwork of ruts. Doors opened briefly as she passed. A woman carrying a basket of eggs paused, staring openly before vanishing inside with a sharp call to someone unseen. The sound of a hammer striking metal rang from the blacksmith shop, punctuating the silence that followed Clara like an echo. Then stood at the far end of the street, its weathered signs swaying on rusted chains. Clara pushed through the door, grateful for the blast of warmth from the fire in the hearth. The scent of wood smoke and boiled cabbage lingered in the air. Behind the counter stood May Carter, a stout woman with silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her eyes flicked over Clara's polished boots, her tailored cloak, the tremor in her gloved hands. "You're the one from the train," May said, voice neither unkind nor welcoming. "Yes." Clara forced her voice steady. "Whitfield. Clara Whitfield. I was told there'd be a room for me." May hesitated, then slid a key across the counter. "Up the stairs, last door on the left. Supper's at 7. Her tone carried no warmth, but Clara felt grateful for the simple efficiency. She moved toward the staircase, but a whisper, low and sharp, reached her ears. "She won't last a week here." The voice wasn't May's. It came from somewhere behind the kitchen door, hushed but not enough. Clara's cheeks flushed hot. She climbed the stairs quickly, refusing to let her tears fall in view of strangers. The room was small but clean, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, a single window framing the endless white of the mountains. She set her bag down carefully, fingers shaking as she retrieved the letter again. It had been written in a strong, careful hand. Asterisk, "If you come, Clara, you will find a place with me. A woman like you deserves better than city gossip and empty promises." Asterisk, she had clung to those words, believing them like scripture. Now, in this stark little room, the ink felt almost cruel, for when she arrived at the station, she'd been met not by the writer of those lines, but by an older man, a deputy, who told her plainly that Samuel Whitford, the man she'd corresponded with for months, had married another. The letter had been sent before he'd even met his bride. The deputy had offered no apology, only a stiff nod of pity, and left her to fend for herself. She sat on the edge of the bed, gloves still on, her body tense as a bowstring. Shame rose thick in her throat. She imagined the whispers that would follow her if she returned home. Foolish Clara, thinking herself wanted. She pressed her hand over her mouth, stifling a sob, but her tears blurred the mountain view until it seemed like the window opened onto nothing at all. That evening, she sat alone at the inn supper table, head bowed over a bowl of thin stew. The murmur of conversation filled the room, punctuated by laughter that wasn't meant for her. A chair scraped across the floorboards, and Clara felt rather than saw the shift in the room's energy. Heads turned, voices lowered. A man entered, a towering figure whose presence filled the space more completely than the fire's warmth. He wore a coat of thick, dark wool, frayed at the seams, and his beard was streaked with snow. His hands, bare despite the cold, looked carved from oak. He moved with a quiet, deliberate gait, pausing at the counter to speak in a voice so deep it seemed part of the timber walls themselves. Clara dared a glance and caught his profile, a strong jaw, a brow furrowed as if from habit rather than thought. He paid for supplies, nodded to May, and left without acknowledging anyone else. "McGraw," someone muttered nearby. "Wild as the hills," another voice whispered. Clara lowered her gaze to her stew, heart hammering. She had seen men like him only in stories, loners who belonged more to the wilderness than the world of people. And yet, something in the way his eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on her, unsettled her more deeply than the gossip around her. The next morning, Clara visited the mercantile to purchase gloves. Her city pair were already fraying at the seams. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a crooked nose, studied her with open curiosity. "You're Whitfield, aren't you? Came up here for that Whitford fella." His voice carried amusement that made her stomach twist. "Yes," she said softly, refusing to look away. He snorted. "He's married now, you know. Folks up here don't take kindly to city folk thinking they can just settle in." Clara thanked him stiffly and left with her parcel. As she stepped back onto the street, the wind sliced through her cloak, tugging at her hat. She pulled it low, wishing she could vanish into the folds of this unfriendly town. By afternoon, the sky darkened, and snow began to fall in earnest, swirling like ash from a great fire. May found her in the inn's sitting room, peering out the window. "Storm's coming in heavy," May said. "This place closes for winter next week. I can't keep you here. Not safe for a woman alone." "I'll manage," Clara murmured, though she had no plan. May's eyes softened. "Elias McGraw's heading back up the ridge today. His place is stocked for winter. He could take you in." Clara stiffened. "That man from the other night?" May nodded slowly. "He's rough, but he's decent. Safer than being stuck here when the roads close." Within the hour, Clara found herself wrapped in layers, clutching her carpet bag as May introduced her to the man himself. Elias McGraw towered over her, his expression unreadable beneath his beard. His voice was gravel when he spoke. "I'll take her." Clara climbed into the sleigh beside him, the wooden runners groaning as they glided over fresh snow. Elias held the reins loosely, his posture relaxed yet alert. For a long while, they traveled in silence, the only sound the horses' steady breath and the hiss of the sled cutting through powder. "You best understand something," Elias said at last, his eyes fixed on the winding trail ahead. "I live alone for a reason. I don't trust myself much around folks." Clara gripped her bag tighter, heart pounding. "Maybe neither do I," she whispered, surprising herself. He glanced at her briefly, an unreadable shadow flickering in his gaze, before turning back to the trail. The journey grew steeper, the snow falling thicker until it seemed the world was made only of white and shadow. Clara's teeth chattered despite her cloak, but she said nothing, unwilling to betray weakness. She caught glimpses of his hands on the reins, calloused but steady, his breath fogging in the frigid air. When they reached his cabin, the sight struck her breathless. A squat structure of hand-hewn logs, smoke curling gently from a stone chimney. The windows glowed faintly, promising warmth. Pines stood sentinel around it, their branches heavy with snow, and beyond them, the mountains rose like silent gods. Elias helped her down, his hand surprisingly gentle as it steadied her elbow. Inside, the cabin was dim but welcoming, lit by a single lantern and the crackle of a fire. Furs lined the floor, and shelves of neatly stacked jars testified to his preparedness. It smelled of pine resin and something earthy, like the man himself. "Put your things by the hearth," he said gruffly, removing his coat. "You'll catch your death if you don't warm up quick." Clara obeyed, her fingers numb as she set down her bag. She felt his eyes on her, but sensed no malice there, only a wary curiosity. He busied himself stoking the fire, the muscles in his shoulders flexing beneath his shirt. For the first time in days, she felt something loosen in her chest. Not safety exactly, but the absence of fear. She sank into the single chair he offered, stretching her hands toward the flames. Outside, the wind howled like a beast at the door, but within the cabin's walls, warmth seeped into her bones. Elias poured her a tin cup of coffee, setting it gently beside her, without a word. She looked up at him, their eyes meeting briefly in the firelight. There was no judgment there, no mockery, just a man who had chosen solitude and now found himself sharing it. She sipped the coffee, its bitterness grounding her. The storm raged outside, erasing the path that had brought her here. She realized, with a mixture of fear and strange relief, that there would be no leaving this place for some time. And perhaps, she thought as she glanced at Elias again, that wasn't the worst fate. The storm swallowed the world, leaving only the cabin and its two reluctant occupants cocooned in white silence. Days slipped into one another, each marked by the rhythm of small survival. The hiss of logs splitting beneath Elias's axe, the soft scrape of Clara's needle as she mended worn shirts, the sigh of snow sliding from the roof. The world outside had grown distant and unreal, but within these timber walls, time seemed to slow and deepen, as though every sound carried meaning. At first, their exchanges were sparse, built of nods and the occasional practical word. Elias rose early, his boots thudding across the floorboards as he carried water from the creek and checked the traps he'd set days before. Clara busied herself tidying, her city-bred hands awkward at first, but gaining confidence. She noticed things. The careful way he sharpened his knife at night, the patience in his voice when he spoke to the horses, the reverence with which he handled his rifle as though it were a tool rather than a weapon. He was a man of few words, but those words, when offered, felt weighty, like stones smoothed by a river. Clara began to find peace in the silence. She had lived her life among voices, women whispering behind fans, men speaking to her as if she were a prize to be displayed. Elias's silence was different. It was not dismissal, nor contempt. It was space, space for her to breathe, to feel the bruises of her shame loosen their hold. One evening, she sat sewing by the fire, and he came in from the bitter cold, snow glistening in his beard. He watched her for a moment before removing his coat, and, without a word, set her gloves on the table. The seams had been carefully mended with sturdy thread. Her throat tightened. "You fixed them," she whispered. He shrugged, settling into his chair. "Couldn't stand to see your hands raw from the cold." That night, Clara lay awake in the loft, listening to the steady crackle of the fire below. Elias's small act of care lingered in her mind, warming her more than the quilt draped over her shoulders. She realized then how little kindness she'd known, not grand gestures or declarations, but these quiet mercies, these small evidences of thoughtfulness. But the outside world was not so far as it seemed. A week later, a rider arrived, a lanky young man on a dun-colored horse, bringing supplies Elias had arranged before the snow closed in. Clara stayed by the window, her heart thudding as she caught the man's curious glance. He tipped his hat but lingered too long, his gaze sliding over her face, her figure, the cabin behind her. Later, Elias said nothing about it, but Clara sensed a heaviness in him as he stacked the sacks of flour and beans. That evening, she heard his voice for the first time hold a note of frustration. "They're talking about you," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the fire. "About me. About us." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "They say you've been ruined, that you're holed up here, 'cause you got no place else to go." His jaw tightened. "They think I'm taking advantage of you." Clara's breath caught. The old shame surged back, thick and suffocating. "I suppose I should have expected as much." Elias glanced up sharply. "They don't know you. They don't know a damn thing." Her voice trembled. "They don't need to know. People don't care about truth. They only care about stories that make sense to them." He looked away, the muscles in his neck taut. "I've lived my life staying clear of folks. Their gossip rolls off me like rain. But you—" He stopped, exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have to bear that." Clara stared at him, startled by the tenderness beneath his gruffness. "You've given me shelter. Isn't that enough?" His gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering there. "I don't want you to regret being here." That night, She dreamt of voices at her back, whispers curling like smoke around her name, but each time she turned, she found only snow and silence. She woke to the sound of Elias stoking the fire below, his steady presence anchoring her in a way she hadn't known she needed. The days grew colder. Clara's fingers toughened from chopping kindling. Her cheeks pinked from the wind when she fetched water. She learned to steady the rifle, though the kickback bruised her shoulder. Elias corrected her stance with quiet patience, his calloused hands guiding hers. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured, and she flushed, not from embarrassment, but from the realization that he meant it. In turn, she sewed him a new scarf from scraps of wool, her stitches uneven but strong. When she placed it around his neck, his expression softened in a way that made her chest ache. He didn't thank her with words. Instead, he wore it every day, even when the work made him sweat. Their bond grew like fire coaxed from embers, fragile yet warming, a connection built from glances and gestures rather than speech. Then came the day when the outside world intruded fully. Clara had been kneeling by the hearth when the knock came, sharp, insistent, carrying the authority of men who expected obedience. Elias opened the door to find 3 townsmen standing in the snow, rifles slung over their shoulders. Their leader, a thick-set man with a weather-beaten face, spat into the snow before speaking. "We're here for the lady," he said flatly. "Ain't proper her staying up here with you." Clara froze. Elias stepped forward, blocking their view of her. "She's safe here." "That ain't the point," the man sneered. "Whole town's talking. Reverend says it's indecent. Folks say she's being held against her will." "She's not," Elias said, voice calm but edged with steel. The man's gaze flicked past him. "Ma'am, you being kept here." Clara rose to her feet, heart pounding. She stepped into the doorway, her voice trembling but clear. "No, I'm here because I want to be." A ripple of surprise passed over the men's faces. The leader scowled. "You don't know what you're saying. This man, he's no good for you." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Clara interrupted, her voice rising despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I have nothing left in that town but whispers. Here I have peace." She faltered, glancing at Elias, whose stillness radiated danger. The man's hand twitched toward his rifle. "This ain't your choice." Elias moved then, slow and deliberate, his massive frame filling the doorway. "You'd best get off my land," he said softly, the kind of softness that made Clara's blood run cold. His hands were empty, but his presence alone carried weight. For a tense moment, no one breathed. Snowflakes drifted lazily between them, catching in Elias's beard. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. The men shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering under his gaze. Finally, the leader spat again, muttered something under his breath, and turned back toward his horse. The others followed, their boots crunching through the snow as they retreated down the trail. Elias closed the door and leaned against it, his chest rising and falling as if he'd just wrestled a bear. Clara touched his arm gently. "You could have been shot," she whispered. His voice was hoarse. "Wouldn't have let him take you." Her breath caught at the fierce sincerity in his words. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a moment she saw past the beard and the bulk of him to the man beneath, a man who had chosen solitude not from cruelty, but from fear, from a belief that the world had no place for him. In that gaze, she felt the reflection of her own wounds, her own exile. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. His fingers curled around her slowly, as if unsure of their right to such a gesture. No words passed between them. None were needed. That night, the cabin felt different. The wind howled outside, but inside, the air carried a quiet intimacy, a closeness that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Clara sat by the fire, watching the flicker of flames dance across Elias's face as he whittled a piece of wood, his expression soft and unguarded. She felt no fear now, only an ache that was both foreign and familiar, like remembering a song she'd once known by heart. Winter began to break weeks later. The snow melted in patches, revealing stubborn tufts of grass, and the creek roared louder as ice surrendered to spring. Clara stood on the porch one morning, breathing in the scent of thawing earth. The town lay miles away, but its voices no longer haunted her. She had found a rhythm here, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Elias joined her, leaning against the railing, his scarf fluttering in the breeze. "You'll be able to go back soon," he said quietly. She turned to him, meeting his eyes. "I don't think I want to." A long silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. He nodded once, as if he'd expected this all along. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, and she felt warmth flood her chest. That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the last snow melt from the mountains. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the ridges. Clara rested her head against the rough wood of the post, feeling Elias's steady presence beside her. The world had not forgiven her, nor had it forgiven him. But here in this quiet place, forgiveness didn't seem necessary. Perhaps, she thought, exile was only another word for freedom. Perhaps the life she had dreamed of was not a fine house or a grand love, but this, a man who spoke little yet offered her safety, a home built not on approval but on understanding. When night fell, the stars emerged, countless and bright, and she felt as though they, too, bore witness to this fragile peace. She closed her eyes, listening to the soft crackle of the fire inside and the low hum of Elias's breathing. The world outside their ridge would always be full of judgment, but here, in this cabin on the edge of nowhere, she had found something rarer than acceptance. She had found herself, and somewhere deep in her chest, hope unfurled like a blossom beneath frost, delicate yet unstoppable, as the mountains stood watch in silent blessing.